Happy Tuesday, folks. Welcome back to KPAN today. Heather and I have one interview for you. It was with State Senator Bruce Tarr. We speak with him every week. Actually, really, Heather speaks with him nearly every week. So we have that for you. But Heather, I just want to show you before we get to Bruce, I actually got my vote by mail application over the weekend.
That's exciting.
So I might have to speak with the League of Women Voters again about maybe the legislation, about how that came about, or Bruce the next time we chat with him.
Yeah.
That's going?
Yeah, he mentioned it not in this interview, I think the week before. And from what I understand, the bilingual applications are not out yet. So there's been some kerfuffle about that because it was required that they go out on the 15th, but they'll make it. So good for you.
Yeah, good for me and good for the word kerfuffle. And now here is State Senator Bruce Tarr.
I have been in session over the years at that hour, but not recently, because the legislature over the last number of years has generally tried to avoid those sessions in the early morning hours and generally try to do business within reasonable hours. And usually that means concluding business when we absolutely have to, as late as midnight, maybe a few minutes past midnight. And that usually happens, Heather, in the context of the state budget, or when we're approaching the end of the legislative year and there are things that we absolutely must finish. It does not usually happen with regard to particular bills where there isn't a deadline that is trying to be met. And so I actually think it was unfortunate that we found ourselves in session on such an important bill as the police reform bill at 4 a.m. with still so many unanswered questions about some of its substance. And I actually called for votes to go past 8 o'clock because the Senate has a rule that you cannot go past 8 o'clock. There's usually a rather perfunctory motion that's made to go past 8 o'clock. I asked for it to be voted upon. I could not get the votes to stop at 8. We then went to midnight. The same situation ensued. I asked for a vote, could not get the votes to stop at midnight. Needless to say, I was very, very frustrated. Because it would have been very easy to come back the next day and resume discussions where we might have left them off in the evening before on a really important bill with a lot of complexity. So to say I was frustrated is an understatement. This is a bill that's been moving very, very quickly on a subject that we should address, but we need to make sure that we strike a balance between making sure that victims of abuse, when they occur, and when it occurs, have proper redress and proper accountability. But it's also a bill that needs to ensure that the people that put on a uniform and go out and defend us every day and protect us, and by the way, this issue of protection extends when we're talking about qualified immunity, which is one of the most important subjects in the bill, not only to police officers, but to firefighters and other public employees. And in fact, in the last couple of days, as we were taking up the bill, we heard a lot from a wide variety of people asking us not to move forward with the bill as written. So, for instance, the Professional Firefighters of Massachusetts, with 220 locals all across the state, the State Police Association of Massachusetts, the Massachusetts Association of Police Chiefs, so many people wrote to us. And what's interesting, Heather, is most, if not all of them, said, and I said this on the floor of the Senate, there are 80 to 90% of the things in this bill that we agree with. But the 20 to 10% of the things that we don't agree with could be so negative that they deserve more contemplation and more reflection. And I pleaded on many occasions on the floor of the Senate to say, why don't we move forward with the things that we all agree on and get them moving and take the other things and take some time, a defined period of time, and study them. And that effort was unsuccessful. And so when you wind up at 4 a.m. with a bill that hasn't had a public hearing, where there are significant questions, and in fact, many members of the Senate who are lawyers spoke to the issue of qualified immunity. I was one of them. But one of the non-lawyers spoke to it and said, I've heard at least 4 members of the Senate who are lawyers speak to the issue of qualified immunity, and not one of them have said the same thing. And so when you have that situation, the right thing to do, the responsible thing to do, is to continue the conversation. And so I voted present. because I wanted to signify that many of the things in the bill are agreeable, and many of the things in the bill are deeply concerning, if not outright negative. And I had hoped for better, and I had hoped for a different compromise. And I'm discouraged that that's the point that we didn't reach. And so, again, I voted in a way that I've only done once before, and voted present.
And the House is now working on their own version of the police reform bill, right?
So they are. So what's interesting, I think our viewers would know that we're talking on a Friday afternoon. And so this week, the House on Thursday and Friday was actually taking written testimony from anybody who wanted to submit it. And I think that was a very wise thing to do. And what I've asked people that have been emailing to us about the bill is, when you send that testimony to the House, please send it to me also. And my staff, because the deadline has closed now for the submission of written testimony, is working on compiling everything that everyone sent to us so that I can read it over the weekend and have the benefit of that input, which I didn't have when I was asked to vote on the bill at 4 in the morning, a few days ago. So the process continues, and it should continue. And the House is expected to release a bill, I would say sometime early next week, and debate that bill next week. And that's going to set up a situation where what I think will be two different versions that will have significant differences will have to be reconciled by a 6-person conference committee, 3 members of the House, 3 members of the Senate. I fully expect to be one of those 6 people. And I look forward to continuing to try to find the right way forward here. And that is going to be a significant challenge, but it's one that we need to try to address.
There are a lot of state legislatures around the country who are trying to address this right now. Is there any form of this legislation that you're seeing somewhere else in the country that you think is a good model?
We're still looking at those. The one place that, one state that many people cite is Colorado, where they reduced the availability of qualified immunity. And by the way, I should say, the Senate bill did not eliminate qualified immunity, but it made changes with language that is untested in many ways in that context, and we don't know what it would do, which is the reason that I couldn't support making that kind of a change in the middle of the night. But in Colorado, they did make some changes, but they also limited officer liability in the case of a police officer, because again, remember, qualified immunity applies to public employees generally. They limited it, from my understanding, to $25,000. And that's a much different thing than someone potentially being liable for much, much more than that. Now, in many communities, folks have indemnification through collective bargaining. What the statute in Massachusetts says is that a municipality may indemnify one of its employees by up to $1 million. Colorado did something very different. They capped liability for the individual, thus shifting the rest of the burden to the municipality. But I haven't seen a state yet, and we're still looking, and we'll be doing that again over the next several days, that I can point to as having the absolute correct path on this. We're still looking for that. But when we compare states, it's important that we also understand the differences in those states to begin with. And that's why I brought up the issue of indemnification, because Colorado changed one piece of this in one way and another piece of it in another way. And in Massachusetts, that would be different.
Well, so let's move on from the police reform bill, because we'll be watching the House and see what happens there. But you tied some bows this week on a couple of legislation, right?
We did, and I'm very pleased with all of them. So one of them is something we've talked about in the past, and that is a supplemental budget of about $1.2 billion. And what we're trying to do there is to authorize spending for a number of different things that are related to COVID-19. Things like the cost of personal protective equipment, or some assistance to cities and towns for costs related to the pandemic. And the reason it's important that we do this in a timely way is because having a spending bill that authorizes spending on these things dramatically increases our chances to get federal reimbursement for those things. So our hope is that we can get at least 75% reimbursement for the things that are in that bill. And there are some very positive things in the bill for Cape Ann, for the food bank and for the library and the reading programs and just a whole host of things. So our hope is that by doing this, we will not be spending precious state dollars. We may need to in the first instance, but ultimately we'll be spending federal money.
Well, we can talk about that those state dollars soon, because they started coming in this week, right? A few months
Well,
later.
absolutely. So let me just tell you about two of the other things, and then maybe we can talk a little bit about the state budget. So the second thing is also something that's been discussed a lot, and I actually wish we had done it sooner, but I'm glad we've done it now. And that is to authorize restaurants to deliver cocktails in sealed containers, and as much as 64 ounces of alcohol with a takeout order or delivered order. And that's a lot, I know, and we had a lot of discussion about how we should limit that. But that bill is now on its way to the governor. It's on the governor's desk. And restaurants are telling us that it could significantly improve their revenue picture, because this is one way to earn, again, some not insubstantial amounts of money through this segment of their business. So that is something that's very good, that we're pleased that the governor has now. And the other one is a more difficult situation, but I'm glad that we're taking action. And it has to do with EEE, or Eastern Equine Encephalitis, and the number of different diseases that are related to it. And you may recall late last summer, we saw a real outbreak of EEE. And you remember how it changed our lives. It's funny how we look at things. We think of how our lives have been disrupted now, but last summer, we thought of how disruptive it was not to be able to have youth sports activities and things of that nature.
I know. It feels so sort of innocent.
Yeah. So
very serious.
It was extremely serious, and there's already been some evidence of EEE again this year in the state. And what the experience last year taught us is that we needed a stronger system at the state level. You know, a lot of times mosquito control is handled by our local mosquito control districts, which are regional entities, but not every community is in one. And sometimes there are gaps, and sometimes there are gaps in their ability to do things. And so what this bill does is give the state mosquito control board the ability to do a whole host of things, and in some cases take emergency action. But something that was very important to me is to make sure that we don't forget about the potential negative impacts on the environment and things like pollinators. And we all know how critically important pollinators are to our entire ecosystem. So the bill talks a lot about that, talks a lot about notifying people that have sensitive areas, giving them power to ask for those areas to be exempted from a particular spraying. So the bill, I think, strikes a reasonable compromise. It's something we're going to have to continue to pay attention to see how the bill works. And unfortunately, its provisions will be tested fairly soon, probably because of what we've seen with some mosquito-borne activity already.
So how would that work? If I feel like I live as if I live in a sensitive area, do I contact my town leaders and they contact the state?
Yes, and there also there was a provision that I believe got retained in the bill for you to contact the state directly.
Well, that's a really interesting one. But I do remember how worried everyone was about, kids on the softball field, the baseball field last year. It was really serious. So I'd like to talk about jobs, and we can return to the state budget, which we will finally begin to see what it may look like, right?
Yes.
The Senate was working on this transportation bond bill, in which there may be a lot of jobs. And it's sort of, people are talking about this. It seems they're comparing it to the Depression era times when, we built the Empire State Building and 800 airports, and this bill can do that sort of work and create those kinds of jobs. Do you want to talk about that?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So what's moving right now is a transportation bond bill. It's about $17 billion. And what's important to remember is that this bill is not unique. That every 5 to 10 years we do a transportation bond bill, and what it does is authorize things that the administration can borrow for. It does not dictate that things will actually happen. And I think the last time we talked about this, I used the restaurant analogy that when it comes to a bond bill, the legislature writes what amounts to a menu,
Right.
and then the governor gets to pick what he's going to eat from that menu. So this is not the end of the process. It's an interim step in the process. And this bill in particular focuses on transportation projects, roads and bridges, the MBTA. I worked on to amend the bill to include consideration of charging stations for electric vehicles and to try to cause our electric companies to set rates that are more advantageous to charging vehicles than just standard rates, to try to encourage that. I also co-sponsored an amendment to provide $75 million of additional resources for charging stations. So all of those things come together, and the bill is moving through the legislative process. The Senate approved the bill. I did not vote for the original version of the bill. I'm confident it's going to come back in a version that I can vote for, and that we're all going to be able to get this to the governor's desk. And again, in this bill, we were able to put a number of things for the Cape Ann region as well. Rockport, for instance, had asked for some money for bridges or a bridge that we were able to put into the bill. Gloucester, we put some money in for sidewalk construction and reconstruction. So a lot of those things, but it's important, Heather, to remember that we have to temper expectations. Because something's in a bond bill does not necessarily mean that it will get funded. It means that it's eligible to be funded, because once this bill gets done, and it has to be reconciled ultimately with the House bill as well. Once it gets done and gets to the governor's desk, what that means is the governor now has a list of items that he can look at and say, I want to do this, this, and this. And when those items are selected, the Commonwealth issues bonds, because these are projects that are intended to be capital projects having a life of longer than 5 years. So it makes sense to use borrowing rather than operating dollars. And then those bonds get issued, the proceeds of the bonds get used to pay for those projects.
Well, I realize we talked about this last week, but this week, in the context of it just being announced that we have the highest unemployment rate in the country, and we're looking at this fall, are people in the Senate talking about this bill, at least from what I was reading this week, more in terms of job opportunities? Because we really need to start thinking that way, right?
Well, we do. And again, this is a bill we needed to do, even outside of the context of jobs, because we need to continue to improve, repair, and strengthen our transportation infrastructure. But what we've been discussing, and what was discussed on the floor of the Senate yesterday, was the additional dimension of the bill to be able to create jobs, to infuse dollars into these projects that will get more people working. And so it's a bill that we probably would have done no matter what, but now there's a new emphasis on getting it done, and getting it done in an expedited way so that these funds can become available. That's definitely true. And by the way, there is a bill coming on economic development that's been released out of the House that I expect the House to take up very soon, and then the Senate thereafter, which also looks at job creation. And I think you'll find that maybe even next week, Heather, we'll be talking about that one, and how it is getting fast-tracked as well. And again, that's a bill that Representative Ferranti has done a lot of work on as the chair of the relevant committee to try to put that bill together. And I am eagerly waiting the opportunity to move it along in the Senate. Well,
it feels as if we need to be talking about jobs, right? I mean,
we do.
A subject that is just looming large. And then there's that federal aid that everybody, right? So how are we feeling this week about the federal aid?
Better. It appears much more likely now that we'll see another federal aid bill. The deadline that we've been using is the 20th, that we thought that sometime after July 20th, we would see movement in the House and the Senate. And I think that's going to be the case, that sometime after July 20th, which is not that long from now,
right,
we will see the feds do a bill. And that's important for a whole host of reasons. But in terms of the state budget, it's important because we're projecting between a $6 and $8 billion deficit on a $43 billion budget. And so having federal assistance, it would be critically important to helping us balance the budget without having to zero out our reserves in our stabilization fund, which are at about $3.5 billion. And so we really need that, and that's why we've been pushing things off, and why we don't have a full fiscal year 2021 state budget, even though we are now midway into the first month of the fiscal year. But the other thing that's important, and we've talked about this a little bit in the past, is that we pushed off the filing deadline for income tax to match the federal delay to July 15th. So now we'll be looking at that as well and seeing how did those unemployment numbers translate into income tax numbers, and how much of a loss are we going to suffer there as well. But there's one thing I want to stress, and I'm not sure that it gets enough attention, is that with that as a backdrop, you don't hear anyone talking about a shutdown of state government or obligations not being met. That's simply not something that happens here in the Commonwealth. We passed an interim budget. We passed a borrowing bill to allow us to do some interim borrowing to meet our obligations. We will likely, within a very short time, within the next 2 weeks for sure, pass another interim budget. This one will probably be for more than a month, just so we can see what's happening and get a better gauge on it. But we won't shut down state government. There is no disagreement here among anybody from any party. We know that we need to keep moving, and we will. And then at some point, when we have a better read on both tax revenue for the state and federal support from some congressional action, then we'll roll up our sleeves and do a budget for the rest of the year. And that's going to require some hard decisions. It's not going to be something we all like to do, but it's something that we are obligated and committed to do.
Is there, is anyone talking about bringing all the members back onto the floor and no longer working remotely?
At some point, we will, in order to pass the budget, we will have to be in a formal session. And so that means we'll have to do something with our rules, because the rules say we aren't in a formal session after July 31st. That does not necessarily need to happen with everyone physically present. So we are holding formal sessions right now with some members being remote in their homes, some people being in their offices, and a very small number of us being actually on the floor. So it isn't a necessity to have us all physically present on the floor of the Senate, and I don't think that's going to happen for quite a long time. But we will have to have a formal session that right now would not be within the rules.
And lastly, I know that this is being discussed all over the place, but Sam Adams closed their fancy outdoor dining space because there were too many out-of-town guests there, right? What do you hear about that? About, people not quarantining, coming into the state from around the country. What are you hearing about that?
So just about an hour ago, I finished our weekly leadership call. Now it happens actually twice a week, but the Friday leadership call with the governor, the lieutenant governor, the Speaker of the House, the Senate president, myself, the House Minority Leader, the Ways and Means chairs, and the Secretary of Administration and Finance. And this came up again. And what Governor Baker was indicating is that we still are doing well in Massachusetts, but we're all concerned about the threat that may come from other places that aren't doing as well. And up until now, there hasn't been a lot of travel taking place, but as people begin to move around, that does become an issue. And for instance, there is a difference of opinion right now between our state and the state of Maine, where Maine still wants people from Massachusetts to quarantine, but we don't say that about people from Maine. We say that from the 7 states, including New England and New York, New Jersey, that we think everyone has done such a good job and continues to do that, that we're not going to ask them to quarantine. But people from other parts of the country, we do ask for the 14 days. That is not compulsory. We request that. It would be very difficult to enforce. But this is going to present a significant problem. And, that problem is something that we saw even on Cape Ann last weekend with regard to beaches that were overflowing and streets that were jammed with cars that were illegally parked. we have to think about how we can be respectful of our desire to have people visit us, because we, in particular on Cape Ann, have an economy that benefits a lot from tourism, but how we protect public health. And this afternoon, as we talk, I don't have a good answer for you, but I will say that a lot of us are very concerned that as people become more mobile, particularly from other parts of the country coming into Massachusetts, we need to think carefully about a strategy to minimize the threat of transmission of coronavirus. Heather, and I also just want to give a big shout out to Mary Jane McGlennon, who I was able to visit this week. She was one of our unsung heroines in Massachusetts, and I was able to bring her a Senate citation, and I know that our representative recognized her as well. And unsung heroines are women in Massachusetts who do things largely behind the scenes that don't often get a lot of recognition. And Mary Jane has just been a driving force behind the Grace Center in Gloucester and deserved the recognition a lot. And it was such a treat to be able to go to Annisquam on a sunny day and be able to present her with that citation. Now, the break in the action didn't last long, but it was one that I appreciated.
So I think this police reform bill has been really tough on everyone. The senator confessed that this was one of the most difficult times he's experienced in his many years in the state Senate. And everyone is feeling as if they're just a little bit frayed. So I think it reflects what the whole country is feeling right now.
Very complicated and delicate subject, and we thank Senator Tarr for his time. We'll catch up with him later on at the end of this week. Tomorrow we have Dr. David Rabin, a cardiologist at Salem Hospital, right?
That's the one, North Shore Medical Center, actually.
There you go. And we'll have the latest updates on COVID and how that is affecting folks here closer to home. And we're also going to speak with Chris Griffith. He is the director of the Gloucester Stage Company, to see how their program is playing out this summer. So there is that. Enjoy your day. We will catch you first thing tomorrow.